In this video, we're going to be exploring whether Supergrass is one of the most underrated Britpop bands. There was the Britpop war that pitted Oasis against Blur with their singles Roll With It and Country House, and this war is still talked about today. There are actually programs still produced talking about this. Did this war perhaps overshadow Supergrass? So let's start with a brief backstory. Supergrass was formed in Oxford in 1993 by Gaz Coombs, Mick Quinn and Danny Goffey. Hopefully I pronounced those names right. Later they were joined by Rob Coombs on keyboard. In 1995 they released their debut album I Should Coco. This album has sold over 1 million copies worldwide and reached the #1 spot on the UK album chart. The late Taylor Hawkins from the Foo Fighters was a great fan and said this quote, "While I was playing for Alanis when I first met Danny, I worshipped Supergrass. My audio wallpaper for that year, 1996, basically comprised of 4 albums. The Foo Fighters' first record, Jeff Buckley's Grace, Radiohead's The Bends, and Supergrass' I Should Coco." There's a great clip on YouTube of when Supergrass supported the Foo Fighters and Taylor Hawkins actually jumped on the drums for Caught by the Fuzz, and at the end of the song Danny Goffey comes on and essentially takes them out. So it reached #1, sold over 1 million copies. Yet we're still talking about whether Supergrass was underrated. And it's not just me, there's several YouTube comments if you go onto pretty much any Supergrass video that say that they are the most underrated Britpop band, and even going far as to say the most underrated British band of all time. So let's talk about the album. There was 5 singles that were released. We've got Caught by the Fuzz, Man-Sized Rooster, Lose It, Lenny and Alright. Every single reached a new peak for them in the UK album chart, culminating in the final single release of Alright. So this song is, in my opinion, their most well-known song here in the UK. It reached #2 in the singles chart. I'm not sure what their most well-known song is actually in the US. If any US viewers are watching, drop a comment below and let us know which song is most well-known. Alright is an upbeat and themic piano-led song with an iconic video of the 3 band members on bikes with names on their t-shirts, and to me this really just shows the 90s, the colours that are used. It's pretty iconic in my opinion. I mean, look at those glasses, you can't really get more 90s than that. But here's the potential issue. If you have a listen to Alright and then listen to Caught by the Fuzz, they're really completely polar opposites. Alright is much more upbeat, restrained, and it also has a really cool guitar solo in it that Caught by the Fuzz doesn't. With that being said, Caught by the Fuzz has a really interesting chord progression in it, and I really recommend that people learn that song. I think Alright was a song that perfectly encapsulated the feeling and the culture of the UK at the time, obviously with the Britpop music being released and also Cool Britannia. Now we can't even accuse Supergrass of being one of those bands that release their debut album and then don't release another album for 3 or 4 years. They were pretty prolific in the 90s, averaging an album every 2 years to the end of the 90s. In 1997 they released their second album, In It For The Money, which I've seen plenty of people on YouTube say that it's actually better than I Should Coco, or even go as far to say it was the best album of the 90s, or one of the best albums. Now this album actually sold more copies than I Should Coco, and the lead single off it, Richard III, reached #2 on the singles chart, which matched Alright. This song also charted on the US Heat Seekers chart. Richard III to me is a sibling of Caught by the Fuzz from I Should Coco, with that punky guitar sound and vocal delivery. So let's summarise this album, that it actually sold more than their debut album. The lead single matched the peak in the singles chart that their hit single did. But I think if you were to play the first 10 seconds of Richard III and the first 10 seconds of Alright, most people here in the UK will recognise Alright and be able to identify it. whereas with Richard III I'm not quite too sure. And perhaps this is the problem, is the comparison with Alright. Supergrass famously did not want to make another Alright and actually took it out of their live sets. There's actually a funny quote here from Gaz Coombs that says, in a 1999 interview, Gaz Coombs joked, "We don't play Alright anymore. We should play it in a minor key and in the past tense." Now this is actually pretty funny, and I'll probably pay good money to see Supergrass actually do this. But it's clear that they were not a fan of just making that song over and over again, and like I said, they actually took it out of their live sets.
Well, we don't normally play this song, but for you guys, we'll do it.
In 1999, Supergrass released their self-titled album, otherwise known as the X-Ray album. Now this album contains possibly my favourite song by Supergrass. It is Moving. Although I'm a guitarist, the vocal delivery by Gaz Coombs in the intro is so perfect. And the guitar chords behind that are actually quite different. They're not just your standard open chords. And you've got that really unique strumming that's actually quite hard to get exactly to the track. And then after the intro, it then hits you with that Supergrass sound. For me, this is pure Supergrass, the vocal delivery of Gaz Coombs, the really severely underrated bass playing by Mick Quinn and his harmonies, and then you got Danny Goffey's frenetic drumming. From this point onwards, it was very much a case of diminishing returns, certainly from a commercial view. The band split up in 2010, citing musical differences, but they did get back together in 2019 for some live shows. They didn't go into the studio. I don't quite have the quote for it, but it essentially was they don't want to bring up old tensions by going in the studio. So I think they still have those musical differences, but they obviously got back together and did some tours and Glastonbury, etc, etc. So I'm going to wrap things up now and just ask you a simple question. Do you think that Supergrass are underrated? In my opinion, they are. And why is the reason for that? I think to categorise them as Britpop is wrong and naturally compares them to those heavyweights of Oasis and Blur. You know, both these bands were and really are massive. Blur's recently sold out Wembley Stadium. They did 2 dates there, so that's 90,000 people each night. And obviously Oasis, we all know the story of that. If they got together, they could probably sell out Wembley Stadium maybe 10 times over. You know, these are massive bands. Would this have changed if Supergrass made more songs like Alright? Well, I'm not too sure. In 1999, they released a song called Pumping on Your Stereo. For me, this is quite similar to Alright. Didn't really match the same peak that Alright had or the mainstream success. I think where Supergrass really shined was their 70s influenced punk sound, and I think this is perhaps where they get overlooked by the general public.